The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. This is Patricia Murphy. We did a little test run, and all four of us swear that we're not touching any, or five of us swear that we're not touching anything to end the webinar. But I'm just going to mute myself, and none of us are going to touch any of the buttons, and hopefully we're not going to get kicked off of it again. But if we do, please log back on. Okay, Kara, finish up the housekeeping, and then let's do this.
Okay.
Kara, okay.
Got it. So if you called in and you did not register online, you will not be able to participate. You need to use the link to register if you wish to ask questions and participate in the webinar. If you have issues with your computer microphone, you can use the sound check button on the audio control panel to help troubleshoot. There is a handout of the presentation that we have in the dashboard. You should be able to see that. If you have any issues with that or cannot locate that, please feel free to email me and I can get that sent out directly after the presentation or tomorrow. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit the question using the questions box and be sure you include your name and your question. There will be some questions that'll be very property specific, so we may ask you to email them to us. Otherwise, we will try to get to as many questions as we can during this roundtable. Thank you for your participation, and we will now move on to the roundtable.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carolyn Metzger, and I'm a compliance monitor with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. And myself, along with Nicole Martinez and Kara Poli, are the department's utility allowance team. I know a lot of you got really used to dealing with Cody Campbell for these issues, but if you weren't aware, he recently accepted a position as the manager of our physical inspection staff, and he has washed his hands of utility allowances and will no longer take your questions. So you're going to have to deal with us from now on. We've been wanting to have this roundtable for quite some time now because we do see a lot of non-compliance related to utility allowances. And we get a lot of requests for additional training and discussions on certain topics. Before we get to it, I do want to mention that I hadn't envisioned this as being a utility allowance training. I do want to go through each of the methodologies and kind of share with you some challenges that we see quite frequently, some stuff that we have a hard time ourselves wrapping our heads around, and then maybe get your feedback on how we can make all of these topics easier to understand and result in less non-compliance. I do recognize that this format is not great for an interactive conversation. However, at this time, this is what we have to work with. So I do encourage you to participate if you can, and then I won't just be talking at you guys the entire time. So like Kara said, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted to the department's YouTube account. So if you don't feel comfortable being on the recording, you can email us separately and that's totally fine. We are planning some upcoming utility allowance trainings that might be more in line with what you guys are looking for. And we hope to have those recorded and posted to the department's website sometime in the first couple months of next year. We're thinking about doing just a general utility allowance compliance training. Maybe we'll go through 10.614 of our compliance monitoring rules and touch on different topics that might help you stay in compliance. Also, we are planning on doing a step-by-step how-to training for the HUD utility schedule model. I know a lot of you have been requesting that, and we are definitely going to make it happen. But that is not really what we're going to discuss today. We are going to discuss stuff like building types when it comes to the HUD model, but as far as like inputting data and where things go, we're not going to get that specific. So real quick, before we start, I just kind of want to briefly touch on what a utility allowance is and why we have one. A UA is an estimate of what it will cost a resident to pay their utility bills. And different parties have different motivations for calculating these in different ways. Obviously, if the utility allowance is lower, it allows the owner to charge more rent. If it's higher, it gives the tenant more relief and the rent ends up being lower. What we strive for and what we hope that you do as well is the most reasonable and accurate estimate that we can get. And while we're talking through these issues today, I'm hoping that everybody will brainstorm and kind of think of ways to make that more likely to happen. So first of all, we're going to just touch on some general compliance topics. Again, nothing too in-depth, but I just want to make sure that everybody is kind of thinking the same way as we go through these issues. First of all, this is the department's website. This link will take you to the utility allowance page where you can find all the forms that you need to request things like annual review or to change your methodology. We do update these forms periodically, so if you have them saved to your desktop or anything, you might want to just check back every once in a while and make sure you're using the current version. Also on the website, there are links to applicable regulations having to do with utility allowances, and there is a frequently asked questions section. The utility allowance is a building rule. So when you're thinking about whether your property is in compliance, you want to not think about the property as a whole, but about each building on its own, because there are many different ways that could require different buildings have different utility allowances. You want to make sure that each building is in compliance. Once you have a properly calculated utility allowance, how do you demonstrate compliance? Obviously, when we come out to monitor a development, we will test rent with the correct utility allowance. But before that even happens, we're going to look at your unit status report and make sure that it's updated. So anytime you get an approval letter from us or the Public Housing Authority releases a new schedule, the first thing you want to do is update that unit status report. So there are 5 methodologies to choose from, assuming you don't have rural development or a HUD regulated building. And I'm going to go through each of these and kind of talk about what we've been seeing compliance-wise. 4 of these 5 methodologies do require annual approval. So you're going to want to make sure you submit for that by October 1st of each year. And anytime you want to switch from one method to another, you'll need to request department approval. So you can do that by going to that website that we just showed and downloading the questionnaire and completing that and uploading it to the development CMTS account. Let's talk about switching methodologies. You can switch methodologies anytime you want to. It's not just once a year. If you don't like what you're using, you should feel free to submit a new request to switch. And at that time, you must also post a notice to your residents, a 90-day notice, so that they get a chance to review what you're changing to. What if you want to stop or start charging for a utility? This also requires department approval. So if, for example, at lease up, your development is charging residents for electricity, and the owner is paying the water and sewer bills for the entire development. And then in year 3, the owner decides that he wants to pass on some of that cost to the residents. He may submit a request to the department to begin charging for water and sewer. And again, you just need to fill out the questionnaire and submit that to CMTS. For this, you do not need to post a notice to the resident because it's not going to be a property-wide all-at-once thing, right? Every resident has a lease, and that lease lays out which utilities they are and are not responsible for. So once we approve that, you'll want to implement on a case-by-case basis at lease renewal. So implementation at lease renewal, that's only for if you want to stop or start charging for a utility. If you're doing annual review or switching methodologies, when we approve that, we will issue you a letter that will have an implementation deadline on it, and you want to make sure you implement property-wide by that implementation date. Let's talk briefly about lease-up. So you will have a utility allowance approved for use at underwriting. That's what the property is underwritten with. And you're not required to review that utility allowance or implement a new one until the building has achieved 90% occupancy for a period of 90 consecutive days, or the end of the first year of the credit period, whichever is earlier. Now, if you want to change methodologies or update your UA before that, you may. You'll just have to submit a request to the department, but you don't have to. So if for some reason you forget to do it for a year, you're probably not going to get dinged because it wasn't a requirement. Okay, I'm going to move on to the methodologies unless we have any questions so far. No? Okay. So if you have rural development or project-based Section 8, something like that, that makes it a HUD-regulated building, obviously those agencies are going to approve your utility allowance, and that is what you will use for all low-income units in your building. I'm not going to go into those because it doesn't involve any back and forth with the department. We are going to look at what they issue you and say, this is your utility allowance. So before I get into the 5 options that we do manage, I want to point out that unless you have multifamily direct loan funds, that's home, NSP, TCAP repayment funds, or National Housing Trust Fund, you can combine methodologies. You can say, I'm going to use the Public Housing Authority method to calculate the water and sewer portion of the utility allowance, and I'm going to use the HUD model to calculate the electric portion. That's completely fine. Let's talk about the Public Housing Authority, which also, if you have multifamily direct loan funds, you cannot use this methodology. So this one's pretty straightforward. It's kind of the default methodology. Everybody's really familiar with it. Let's talk about where we see the most issues. First, you want to make sure that you select the correct public housing authority. So if we're talking about like what trumps what, at the top is if you live in a city that has a public housing authority that publishes a Section 8 utility allowance, that's what you have to use. If your city does not have that program, then you move on to county. If the county doesn't, then you can go to the regional housing authority and the council of governments if that applies to your area. So for example, the city of Houston. If you have a development in the city of Houston, which is in Harris County, you do not get to choose which utility allowance you use. You must use the one for the city of Houston. The only way you could use Harris County is if the city of Houston did not publish a Section 8 utility allowance, or if you're outside of the city. Second, once you choose the right PHA, you want to make sure that you're using the schedule for the correct building type. I know that not all housing authorities publish multiple schedules for different building types. I've seen some that just publish one for single family houses. And I say, well, this isn't right. You have an apartment. And they say, well, we're only creating one. This is for everything. No matter what kind of building you have, you should use this schedule. And that's completely fine. You just want to make sure you get clarification from the housing authority if that's the case. The next thing we see a little bit of is excluding the electric or gas fee. Again, not all PHAs have this fee on their schedules, but some of them will have like a $16 electric fee or $10 gas fee. And if the resident is responsible for paying for electric, you must include the electric fee in your calculations. Same thing goes for gas. The last thing that we've seen a little bit of lately, and it's not very common, but we have seen it in a couple of areas, is PHAs that are charging for owners to get an updated utility allowance schedule. And unfortunately, they are permitted to do this. Their justification is we had to pay somebody to create this schedule for us, so we're going to pass that cost along to owners. We have tried reaching out to some of these PHAs, and they're not any more likely to give us the schedule than they are you free of cost. So there's not really any way we can help you with that. Your options at that point are you can pay for the schedule or you can choose a different methodology. Just because they're charging for it doesn't mean that you can use an old, outdated schedule. That is what we are seeing with the Public Housing Authority. Like I said, that's a pretty straightforward methodology, but if any of you are seeing different issues that you want to talk about, I'm happy to hear them. Do we have any questions? Nope. Okay.
Carolyn, there's one question for the PHA method, if you want to address it. It says, if there is no applicable PHA, is it ever possible to request a review to approve a PHA within the area for the project? For example, we accept vouchers, but the PHA is not applicable to the project.
No, you cannot use a public housing authority that does not meet the requirements of the rule. Now, you will use that schedule for those people receiving the vouchers, but you can't use it as a general utility allowance for the entire property. Is that it?
I'll chime in a couple of things.
Yeah.
So I'm not really sure if public housing authorities are allowed to charge. I feel like they're probably subject to open records laws. So, I mean, there's nothing that we can do about it, that they're charging owners for that. But it does seem like a problem that they're a governmental entity and they're saying, I have a document that the public doesn't have access to. Seems like an issue. And the question about can the department approve the use of a PHA when there's not one in the area? Is a hard no. We used to, in our rules, have some provisions for doing that. And in the most recent rulemaking that the IRS did with what this is Treasury Regulation 1.42-10, is that correct? In the reasoned response they did, they commented that they were unaware that there's places in the nation that don't have a public housing authority that serves the area, and it's absolutely not an option for a housing tax credit property to use the PHA method if there is no PHA that serves the area.
One other thing I'd like to add about that is that our rule does allow for you to use a different PHA, like for example, maybe the city next to your city, if that PHA publishes an allowance specific to your area. So if that allowance, let's see, Dallas and Plano. Let's say Plano didn't have a housing authority, but Dallas published an allowance specific to the city of Plano, then that would be allowable. But that's the only situation where that would be okay. Anything else, Nicole?
Let's see. Rafaela just asked the same question, but you just answered it with the nearby city.
Looks like we have a question about using the energy efficient version of the PHA schedule for 9% applications.
Go ahead, Karen.
We don't approve the PHAs for applications, so that's kind of between you and the underwriting group. But if you're going to use it at operations, you would need to be able to show during your monitoring review that you have that, you meet that requirement.
And as far as PHAs go with energy efficiency, if you want to use that schedule, that's kind of up to the PHA to define that, whether you're energy efficient or not. So you'll need something from the PHA saying what their definition of energy efficiency is, and then documentation showing that your building meets that definition. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to written local estimates. So this one is also pretty straightforward. It's an estimate obtained from the utility provider. A couple things you want to make sure of is that the provider letter is from a utility provider that services the development. So there's that Power to Choose website where you can enter the development zip code and it'll come up with a whole bunch of different plans that are available in the area. You can use any of those plans. The estimate must include all utilities that residents pay, as well as all component charges. So there are a couple letters floating around, or that we saw earlier this year, that explicitly excluded air conditioning and or plug load, which I guess is anything you plug into your wall, your cell phone charger, lamps, stuff like that. These are not acceptable letters. The resident is responsible for paying for their cost of AC and plug load, so the letters must include those. You might want to go back. I'm sure we didn't catch them all, so if you are using this methodology, you might just want to take a quick look at the letter and make sure it doesn't have any of that language, because we will be looking at it whenever we monitor the property. And if you have one of those, then it's not a properly calculated utility allowance. Does anyone have any questions about the written local estimate? It's pretty straightforward. Anything you want to add, Patricia or Kara or Nicole? Nope. Okay. Energy consumption model. It's going to be super quick. This is that one that's calculated by a licensed mechanical engineer. We really don't see any issues. Make sure it's an actual licensed engineer and submit documentation to show that. Other than that, this one's pretty easy. You have to pay for it probably, but other than that. Okay, I want to move on to the actual use method. This is the one where you collect 12 months of billing history from your tenant and submit all this data to the department along with a rate plan. And then we're going to like average out how much they used and calculate a utility allowance for you. This is definitely the most accurate of any utility allowance estimate, because it's based on your actual tenant use, right? And the rates that they're actually using. And we barely see anybody use this. We get like a handful of these a year to approve. And I get that it's a lot of work. I probably wouldn't want to go bug people for their bills and put all this data together, but I think that it's a really good methodology. So if any of you guys have any interest in maybe pursuing this at some point, feel free to get with one of us and we can walk you through it, maybe make it less, menacing or whatever. The one thing with this methodology is that since we are calculating it for you based on the data you submit to us, and we need you to post to your residents by 10/1, it is due every year by August 1st instead of October 1st like the rest of the methodologies. Do we have any questions about the last two, the energy consumption model or the actual use method? Well, we are just flying through these. Okay, this is the big one. I saved it for last because it's super fun. The HUD utility schedule model. I think that most of your questions that you submitted when you registered had to do with this method, so give you plenty of time to talk about it. This is that fancy HUD Excel spreadsheet with the 4 tabs. In the first tab, you enter stuff having to do with the location of the property, the zip code, and it'll populate all this data. The second tab is where you enter the tariffs. So once you pick a rate plan, you're going to enter, the cost per kilowatt and the transmission charges and taxes and all that stuff. The third tab has to do with building characteristics. So you pick the building type and then down below which utilities the residents pay. This is also where you can pick the green discount if your building qualifies for one of those. And then the last tab is going to spit out all the numbers. And if you go to the bottom and do like an auto sum, then it'll give you your utility allowance for each bedroom size. One thing I want to point out about this is that we review a lot of these every year, a lot. And it is pretty common to see errors in the inputting of data. And I just want to let you guys know that it's not a big deal. If you submit something and you put a decimal point in the wrong place and it spit out a $600 utility allowance, I promise we are not going to approve a $600 utility allowance and then force you to use it for a whole year. So don't worry, we'll review it when we get it, and we'll make sure that it's fixed and that it's not an insane number. So once we approve it, we're going to stick it on our letterhead and send it out to you, and there's going to be an implementation deadline that you have to implement property-wide, and you're going to keep the letter on file, so whenever we monitor your property, you should have no problems, right? Well, let's talk about what can go wrong. First of all, the questionnaire that you submit with your annual review or your request to switch methodologies, we want to make sure that that is filled out correctly. One of the things that sometimes people get a little messed up on is which utilities the residents pay. For example, for water heating, you have the option to select, is this billed to each resident based on actual consumption, or is this like a boiler system which the owner pays? If you select boiler system, we will exclude that line item from your utility allowance. However, if through like a resident complaint or something, we find out that the residents are actually responsible for paying for water heating, then our approval letter is no longer valid. So you would not have a properly calculated utility allowance. Another thing is the type of heating. And I think this is a relatively new addition to the questionnaire. So you'll want to make sure you're using the current version. You can choose between heat pump or electric resistance. And I don't know what those things mean, but I do know that depending on what you pick, it will change the amount of your utility allowance. And I'm sure there's somebody at every development that knows which is which. So just make sure you're picking the same thing every year and that it's the correct choice. The next thing, you want to make sure you're submitting a rate plan that the development uses, that residents of the development have access to. Same thing with the written local estimate. If your development is located in a deregulated area, which means residents have a bunch of different options on what utility provider to use, then the first thing we do when we get your submission is we're going to go to that Power to Choose website, enter the development zip code, and make sure that that plan is available to them. If you're in a regulated area, that means the residents don't have a choice. Like the city of Austin, most people in the city of Austin can only use the city of Austin for electric. So what happens when we go to the Power to Choose website and enter a zip code for a development like that is it's going to come up with no options. It's not going to give us the one provider. It's going to say, nope, you're in a regulated area. So we're kind of taking your word for it for the most part when you submit a rate plan from a provider in a regulated area. Well, I mean, we're using a little common sense. If you're in the city and it's from the city, we're going to assume that's a valid rate plan. But there are ways that that can go wrong. I just use, for example, San Marcos. The city of San Marcos does provide electric service to some neighborhoods. However, the majority of San Marcos can only use the PEC, the Pedernales Electric Co-op. They have a monopoly over most of that area, but most likely if you submitted the city of San Marcos for that development, I would have no way of knowing that they could not use them. So I'm going to take your word for it, and I'm going to calculate the allowance based on that rate plan. And it would probably be through a resident complaint or something like that that we would find out that we have a problem. Okay, building type. We got a lot of requests to talk about building type. And this is the biggest challenge with the HUD model that we see. I'm not just talking about from management companies and people submitting them. I'm talking about for us. It's been really hard for us to wrap our head around this. And the HUD documents that we rely on aren't super user-friendly or helpful at all. So I just kind of wanted to take you guys through the process of how the department determines building type so that at least we're all on the same page. And while I'm talking about this, if you guys have any ways that we can make this easier, I mean, if it means amending our utility allowance rule or I don't know, redefining building type, I'm open to suggestions because this is just kind of a mess. So the HUD model gives 5 options for building type. Okay, so you can use single family house, single family attached, low-rise apartments 2 to 4 units, larger apartment buildings with 5 or more units, or manufactured homes. Those are the options in that tab 3 of the HUD model. And luckily we can rule out a couple right away, right? Single family house, that's a single unit occupied by a single family. It's a house. That's pretty self-explanatory. You'll know if your property is single family houses. Manufactured homes, that's mobile homes. And I believe the department only has 1 of these in our inventory. So chances are none of you are ever going to have to choose this option. It's the other 3 where it gets a little complicated, especially when you're trying to decide between low-rise 2 to 4 or single family attached. And even the apartments 5+ gets a little weird because you want to assume that if you have more than 5 units, you fall into this category, and that's a lot of the times not true. For example, if you have 8 units, 8 townhomes that are right next to each other in a row, that's going to be single family attached. It's not going to be apartments 5+. So let's talk about how we determine which option to choose. Keep in mind that when you submit all your HUD stuff to us, all the backup documents and the spreadsheet and everything, we have no idea what your building looks like. We may have been there before, but if we have, we don't remember. And we're depending on solely what you put on your questionnaire when determining building type. So there are 2 HUD documents that we would like you guys to familiarize yourself with. And this is how we determine building type currently. So the first one has a really stupid name, and it is called HUD's Job Aid for Configuring Buildings and Units. And this was actually created for use by the Office of Public and Indian Housing, which is, it's the Public Housing Authority, right? It wasn't even really meant for the HUD model, but it's what we have to work with, so that's what we're doing. Also, it was created in 2007, which was, at that time, the HUD model had completely different options for building type. So again, this document is going to lead you to a building type that's not going to be an option on the HUD model. So to solve that problem, HUD has another document on their website that kind of converts the building type in the job aid to those that are available in the HUD model. And I wanted to go through a couple of examples of this. So let's see. I'm going to pull up the job aid. Can we make that bigger? Any way to make it bigger? Maybe they can see that. Okay. So what this does is it asks a series of questions, and you'll answer each question about your building, and then it will lead you to a building type. So for our first example, let's look at a 1-story building with 10 units, each side by side. So the building that I was talking about at first. So question number 1, does the building have more than 1 unit? Yes, we said it has 10 units. So we go to question 2. Does the physical address use an apartment or unit number? We're going to say that yes, it does. Unit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we go to question 3. Does the building have 1 primary front entrance to the unit? No, it doesn't. Each unit has its own entrance side by side all the way down the road. So we go to question 6, which asks, does the building have more than 2 units? Yes. Again, it has 10 units. So this says, go to example G, which when you scroll down through the document, leads us to row or townhouse with apartment numbers in the address. And it's helpful, it gives little pictures. I actually find the pictures much more helpful than the questions. If you can just scroll through the examples and kind of pick out which picture looks like your building, then that's a pretty easy way to tell which of these examples you should fall under. So the problem is, as we know, the HUD model does not give an option for row or townhouses. So let's go over to that other document. You make it a little bigger. Thank you. Okay, so scroll down and you're going to find row or townhouses, which is the second one. Duplexes, row, or townhouses. And that converts to single family attached in the HUD model. So for that building, you want to pick single family attached. Super easy, right? So I want to do one more example because this one's even more complicated. Let's say that your building is an 80-unit garden style apartment. So let's go back up to the questions. Question number 1, does the building have more than one unit? Yes. Number 2, does the physical address use an apartment or unit number? Yes. Number 3, does the building have one primary front entrance? Let's say yes. You go in the front entrance and that's where all the units are. Maybe it's 3 or 4 stories. Does the building use an elevator for tenants? Let's say no. Let's say it's not an elderly development and these people are just going to have to walk up and down the stairs. So then it says go to example D, which when you scroll down takes you to a walk-up multifamily building. And again, you have the pictures there. Hopefully one of these looks like your building. But let's go back to that conversion chart. So we're looking for a walk-up multifamily. So this could fall under a bunch of things, right? I said this was a garden apartment, so right away you see that that's apartments 5+, but the example says walk-up multifamily. So let's see. There's multifamily down here, which converts to apartments 2 to 4. And then down here we have apartment and then 4 alternatives for apartments, which also convert to apartments 2 to 4. But this is an 80-unit garden style apartment complex, right? 80-unit building. There's no way we want to use low-rise 2 to 4. We want to use apartments 5+. So this is where we're going to use a little common sense. If the questions take you to any of the examples except for that example G, the walk-up multifamily apartments, then you're going to go ahead and use the conversion chart as is. If it takes you to multifamily walk-up and your building has fewer than 5 units, you should select low-rise 2 to 4 in the HUD model. If it takes you to multifamily walk-up and your building has 5 or more units, we want you to pick apartments 5+. That is how we are determining building type, and I wish it was simpler than this, but it's what we have to work with for right now. So I am definitely open to hearing feedback on how we can make this process a little easier for everybody, us included. Do we have any questions so far? Any comments?
We have some questions about what to submit to apply the green discount on the HUD model. Energy Star, for instance, for 2 of them, you should get certificates from an engineer when your building is built. Energy Star, I don't know that I personally have seen anybody try to elect that one. What would they need to submit for that? Patricia, do you have any input, or Carolyn?
I think you just need some sort of certification that says that each building meets that specification. I'm not an engineer. I don't really know a lot about that stuff, but if you submit me a certification that says it's Energy Star, I'm going to believe it's Energy Star.
And then we've got a question about when the questionnaire differs, excuse me, from what the department has in CMTS, which one is the department defaulting to? And I think that's part of what we're trying to explain further, is that if your questionnaire says apartments 5+, but we look in CMTS and we see that each building only has 4 units, we're going to, and vice versa, we're going to look further into that. And I know for me, there are situations where I do look up photos of the property if there's a gray area. But that's an area where if that happens for your property and we issue a HUD model that's for a building type that you don't think you meet, you can definitely email the issuing monitor. You can email all three of us. We are happy to open up that discussion because like Carolyn's explaining, this is definitely an area that we would like to clear up any questions on, but there is some room for interpretation. So I think that's definitely an instance where you'd email us and say, you know, we're townhomes or we're 5+ or whatever.
Also, there was a period of time when we were doing a lot of that, just getting on Google Earth and trying to actually look at the buildings and see what they look like. And we found that wasn't a real reliable method because a lot of developments have multiple building types. So if I can see one building on the screen, that doesn't really help me determine all of your building types. Any other questions?
That's all we have so far, unless I'm...
Or if anybody has brilliant ideas about how to make this easier, that would be great too. Okay. So those are the 5 methodologies that are currently options. That Treasury reg that Patricia was talking about before, 1.42-10, that's the utility allowance reg, and they do lay out all of these options. And most of 10.614, our utility allowance portion of the compliance monitoring rule, is taken directly from that regulation. It's almost verbatim. Where it does differ is that regulation does allow for a 6th methodology if the agency is willing to do it, and that is the agency estimate. And we've only talked about this briefly, so we kind of wanted to get some input from you guys about if you think this would be a good idea, or if you had specific ideas on how to implement this, or if you guys think it would be a terrible idea and no owner would ever take advantage of this, let us know that too, and we just will forget it all about it. So the agency estimate would be calculated by the department, and it would probably be by region or area, something like that. We'd probably also want to do it for different building types. And owners could choose to use this utility allowance instead of one of the other 5 methodologies. We were thinking that maybe we would only calculate it every 3 or 4 years, something like that. And when an owner was approved to use this methodology, they would have to agree to like a cost of living increase on the utility allowance every year instead of us calculating a new one every year. So that approval would be good for 3 or 4 years, and it would just go up by a couple bucks every year. One of the benefits of this is that we could issue these at the same time that income limits come out every year. That way you wouldn't have to worry about adjusting rents or anything like that, but once a year. As to how we would calculate this, we haven't talked it through that much, but we do have a lot of data at our disposal as far as utility allowances we've calculated in each area. Also, the HUD model has this little button that you can push and it spits out the state averages for that area. We could probably tweak that a little bit and do something with that data. Is this something that you think management companies and owners would be interested in? I think we have a poll.
I am going to launch the poll right now, and I will leave that open for just a little bit to see where everybody's at.
Thanks, Kara.
Looks like about half of our folks have voted. I'll leave it open for just a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So it looks
Do we
like we,
Do we get to see the results?
well, it looks like about 70%, only about 52% of our attendees voted, but about 70% say yes, let's do this, and 30% say no way. So
Okay.
that's something we can definitely discuss.
Yeah. There it is. Do we have any questions on anything I've talked about so far, or any feedback?
Looks like we have one new question. If there's a PHA in a city, you must use that UA. Is that correct? I think to clarify that, that's only if your development uses the PHA methodology. If you're in the city of Austin, you can use the Austin Housing Authority's utility allowance, but you can also use written local estimate, actual use, energy consumption, HUD model. You can use any of the approved methodologies as long as you get department approval before you switch. So hopefully that answers that question.
Carolyn, we have a question. Would you be able to combine methodologies with the agency estimates? I don't know if that's something that we even got into yet about that being an option. And also, could we switch methodologies during that approval timeframe?
Well, we haven't discussed combining methodologies with the agency estimate, but I don't see why not. I mean, I think it would be the same as all the other ones. As long as you don't have multifamily direct loan funds, you can probably combine methodologies. What was the second part?
Purpose, though, of us not having to mess with it and them not having to mess with it. The beauty of the agency estimate is it's good for 3 or 4 years with a cost of living increase. And if they're going to combine it with other stuff, but you're right. I mean, I guess it would be addressed through rulemaking and probably would allow it.
Nicole, what was the second part?
I'm trying to get clarification on it because I don't think it goes to the same part of the question.
Okay. Well, I'll open it up for questions again in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and move on and talk about some of the other things we're seeing not related to the methodologies. First of all, I briefly mentioned how things are different if you have multifamily direct loan funds in your building. Again, that's Home, NSP, National Housing Trust Fund, and TCAP repayment funds. So again, you can't use the PHA if you have any of these funds. You cannot combine methodologies. And if you don't submit for annual review by October 1st, the department's going to go ahead and calculate your utility allowance for you. And we do that using the HUD model, and we use the median rate plan that we find in the Power to Choose website. One thing that we do see a lot of issues with is if you have MFDL funds and you also have tenants living on your property that get housing choice vouchers from the housing authority, if you were a tax credit only property, you would use the PHA for those tenants. This is not true for MFDL funds. If we approve a utility allowance for a building with multifamily direct loan funds, that is the applicable utility allowance for every low income unit in the building. The next thing I wanted to touch on was how things change when you go post 15. So during the federal compliance period, the first 15 years of your credit period, if you're using, okay, let me put it this way. If you're using RUBS or a ratio utility billing system, that's if the owner gets the bill for the entire development and then he allocates it to the tenants based on, I don't know, household size or bedroom size or however he sees fit to do that. During the compliance period, that is not considered part of the utility allowance. So during the compliance period, that would be considered a mandatory fee that would be included in the gross rent calculation, but you wouldn't include it in the utility allowance. Let's think about an example property where residents are responsible for paying electric, water, and sewer. They pay their electric directly to the utility provider based on actual consumption, and then the water and sewer is a RUB system. So during the compliance period, their utility allowance would just be the electric portion. If they're using the PHA, they would use all the electric line items. And then their water and sewer, that fee that they are billed every month, would be a mandatory fee. Once a property goes post 15, our rule changes that. So once it goes post 15, all utilities that the household pays must be included in the UA, regardless of whether or not the UA is based on actual usage. So that example property that was using the PHA for electric and RUBs for water and sewer, they would continue being charged the water and sewer fee, but it would no longer be a mandatory fee. Instead, you would also start including the line items for water and sewer in the utility allowance calculation from the Public Housing Authority. And we've seen some problems with this because a lot of times with RUBs, in order to keep it under the gross rent limit with the mandatory fee, the charge is relatively small. It'll be like $15 a month or something like that. Whereas the line items on the PHA schedule, for water alone, it could be 30, 40 bucks, and then just as much again for sewer. So we've had some people run into problems with rent violations when they didn't switch to the post 15 utility allowance procedures. One other thing to note when you go post 15, if you're required to submit for annual review, that requirement doesn't change. You still need to submit every year for annual review for those 4 methodologies. The last thing I wanted to talk about was developments that have a lot of layered programs. We've seen a lot of this over the last few years. People with home and public housing and project-based vouchers and housing choice vouchers and just a myriad of programs. And the question is always, what utility allowance trumps? Which program's utility allowance is above all other utility allowances? And when we monitor, we would like a clear answer to that question as well, because it gets a little complicated, right? So I put together kind of a list of ranking utility allowances. The first one is if your building is covered by HUD Multifamily Notice 2015-4, that is the dictating utility allowance. So what is this notice? This is a notice that kind of lays out the procedure for submitting annual utility allowance data to HUD for approval. And it lists a bunch of different programs that it covers. And if your building has one of those programs, then that is your utility allowance for every rent restricted unit. So a couple of the programs that are covered in this notice are project-based Section 8, rural housing, and Section 811 is listed. However, I would like to note that if you have Section 811 funds through the department, it is our position that we do not have to follow this notice because we're not required to submit annual utility analysis to HUD. So you'll just want to follow our rule when it comes to the 811 units, and it's just for those units. Okay, let's say your building doesn't have any programs covered by that notice. What's next? If your building has Department Multifamily Direct Loan Funds, then that is the applicable UA for every rent restricted unit in the building. So that would be the next thing on the list. And that's true even if your building also has public housing. So they might have a completely different utility allowance. We are still going to require that your USR reflect the multifamily direct loan UA approved by the department. What if your building does not have any of the programs covered by that 2015-4 notice, and they also don't have any MFDL funds from the department? What if instead they have all these other programs like project-based vouchers or public housing? What is the trumping utility allowance then? And our response to that is, you tell us. We do not monitor for compliance with these programs, and we don't have a straight answer for this one. We think that you should get with the people who monitor these programs, the Public Housing Authority, for example, and tell them, ask them, what am I supposed to be using? Because we want you to be in compliance with your other programs too, right? And then you tell us. So before we come out, we'll ask you what programs you have in which buildings, and you can tell us what utility allowance you're using. And then the last thing I wanted to note on this, which I already touched on when we were talking about multifamily direct loan programs, is that if you have tenants with housing choice vouchers in any of these HUD buildings, the HUD utility allowance is the utility allowance for all rent restricted units. You're not going to use the PHA schedule. And with that, I have made it through pretty much everything I had planned. So I'm sure Patricia has some nuggets of wisdom for us that she'd like to share, and then we will take some more questions.
Well, I wasn't expecting this, Carolyn. So I guess I will comment on the rulemaking earlier this year where the department was proposing that the methods where you're calculating the allowance in a deregulated area, that you would need to use a rate plan that's available for 12 months. And that rulemaking was withdrawn and not adopted after being tabled by our governing board. So I don't know if it's entirely a dead issue. I think what the department and the industry need to address is unrealistically low utility allowances. That we definitely see them, and they meet the letter of the rule, and they do not pass the smell test at all. There's just no way that someone's utility bills could actually be that low. And we are the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, and under our community affairs programs, we operate the Comprehensive Energy Assistance Program through Low-Income Energy Assistance Program through Health and Human Services. And just in Texas, we spend $110 million in taxpayer funding on helping low-income people pay their utility bills. And I oversee the monitoring for that program as well. And just because I'm really familiar with the department's portfolio, I know that many of the clients that are receiving this utility bill assistance are residents in our housing tax credit properties. And so on the one hand, we're approving a utility allowance that's like $30 on the second floor of the building, and on the first floor of the building, you know, we're spending $1,200 in taxpayer money to pay the person's actual utility bill, which is nowhere near $30 a month. So I think that these virtual roundtables are very difficult to interact with attendees, and hopefully we will be able to meet in person again someday and continue a discussion about what should the department do when we get a utility allowance that just seems extremely unrealistic, and it's just really out of whack with everything else that we are approving. You know, how should the department handle that? But we're not there right now. And, you know, like Carolyn said, we've got some other ideas about future rulemaking, about maybe coming up with some ideas about defining building types or this agency estimate. I know some other state housing finance agencies do have an agency estimate, and kind of taking a closer look at how are they doing that, and does it work, does it not work? And maybe in some kind of future rulemaking, you can help us address how should we handle unrealistically low allowances that meet the letter of the rule. So the utility allowance team there, you've got all of their lovely faces there now to put with their names and their email addresses. And hopefully in the future, we can have an in-person meeting where it would be easier to discuss these issues and share ideas. And, feel free to type it into the chat box or the question box if you have suggestions for us, or please reach out. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Patricia. Anything else? Nicole? No?
The last thing was when the question to clarify was just if they were going to be able to change the methodologies for the 6th methodology we may add within the 3-year grace period, or within the 3-year approval time. But,
Absolutely. You can always change them.
Yeah, right. Like we allow other methodologies to be changed, and that would just be something that would be added into the rule if we adopted that.
Yep.
We also had a question about if that would be applicable to applications, and I think that would be, addressed in the rule, but I don't see why that methodology would not be applicable. Applications can use PHA or any of the other information or any of the other methodologies. So.
Okay, well, there's nothing else. Thank you guys for attending. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email any one of us and we'll try and get back to you within the next day or so.
All right. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.
So now we just hit the X button and it stops recording this. Okay. Kara, you gonna hit X or do you want me to?
Couldn't find my mouse. I can, if you would like me to. It feels so like definite ending.
Yes. Okay. All right. You end it. Bye.
Bye.